I'm sitting with Dr. Aseem Malhotra, who is a cardiologist and a health campaigner. And today we're going to talk about something that I often talk about on here, and that is stress. Because I wanted to ask him the effect that stress has on the body, because I suspect that people don't realise how incredibly harmful stress is. You know, you feel bad if you have stress, but it also has a physiological reaction in the body. Now, you're a cardiologist, so does stress affect the heart? And I mean, you know, one thinks of heart attacks, so can stress cause a heart attack?
Yeah, it's a great question, Glynis. I think it's something that people are aware of, but we haven't fully appreciated the impact of stress when it comes to chronic disease. And I'll talk about the heart in a minute, but I think one of the things that I found quite shocking when I started looking into this research, about 90% of conditions, whether it's cancers, heart disease, chronic disease in general, is linked to excess stress, right?
Oh no!
And again, what's interesting when we look at the blue zone. So these are areas around the world where these communities have, phenomenal longevity and they live healthily.
Yes.
I studied one of these areas in southern Italy called Pioppi. It was the first book I wrote called the Pioppi Diet. Was based upon this Mediterranean, the home of the Mediterranean diet, which is a little fishing village.
Yes.
Not a very affluent place.
Yes.
But one of the common denominator which we discovered when we were researching this area, but also looking at all these other places around the world, these blue zones, is probably a big driver of their health and longevity is the fact that they have lower levels of stress than most people. And
why is that? Why do they have lower levels of stress?
Well, some of it's environmental, but actually a lot of it was because these communities had a very strong social cohesion.
Right.
And if you look at, what I wrote about in my book, and coming back to heart disease, the two biggest causes of stress in the modern day are work and relationship stress. So the kind of lives that we live, fast-paced lives, people get, workaholic type attitudes, people not investing enough time in enough time in those good quality, meaningful relationships, whether it's with your partner, your friends and your family. There seems to be some protective effect of having good quality relationships from environmental stresses as well.
That's so interesting. And I suppose that's what these communities have, because
absolutely.
Usually they're quite rural communities, aren't they? And they also tend to do a lot of exercise in the form of working the land or fishing.
Yeah.
So they're quite active and remain active till the end of their lives.
Yeah, activity absolutely plays a role as well. For sure, these are all kind of intertwined.
But there's a great communal relationship in the village. Everybody's connected to each other. Everybody knows each other.
Yeah. And interesting, obviously we're coming hopefully to the end of this pandemic on COVID. One of the areas of research I looked in traditionally is about respiratory viruses, coronaviruses, that kind of thing. And researchers have looked into this over many, many years. Looking at the psychology of the drivers of those colds, what makes you more likely to get a cold in the first place and more severely ill. There was a huge correlation in relationship between your social connections. So people who were had more social connections, whether it's being part of community clubs or spending time with friends and family, were much lower risk, massively lower risk of developing.
But none of us have had that in the last few years,
well,
have
I know.
we?
So there's an important role of stress in the immune system too. The impact of stress when it comes to chronic disease, and I'll talk about the heart in a minute, but I think one of the things that I found quite shocking when I started looking into this research, about 90% of conditions, whether it's cancers, heart disease, chronic disease in general, is linked to excess stress, right?
Oh no!
And coming back to heart disease, just to put it in perspective, chronic psychological stress is equivalent to having a single risk factor for heart disease. And again, if it's not managed, you're not managing it. So it's either being diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic, having high blood pressure, being a smoker. The impact of stress on heart disease is equivalent.
As those things?
Absolutely. So it's a really important area that we don't address very well.
Gosh.
And I find certainly with all of my patients that I manage with heart disease that come to see me, invariably, you know, I give a very crude, I ask them a very sort of crude measurement, subjective measurement of their stress. I say, you know, in the last few months to years, on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being no stress at all, kind of think Buddhist monk meditating on the top of a mountain, and 10 being very high levels of stress, where would you be? And almost always, Glynis, they're saying they come back with 7 or 8 or 9. And these are often people sometimes where there's
would be me too.
Where there's no other risk factors as well. So
Yeah.
I've had, for example, not so long ago, a chap in his early 50s who was a martial arts expert, doing 5 to 10 hours of activity a week, had a 6-pack, no risk factors, and had a heart attack. And he couldn't explain it. And we got to this point of the stress discussion. He tells me, Doc, actually, for the last 5 years, my stress levels have been 9 out of 10, and my sleep has been 4 hours of sleep a night. So there you go. You've explained it, right?
Yeah,
so it's something we should not neglect at all.
Stress, yes. No, and I often say on the Ageless site and on my posts and videos, I talk about stress a lot, and I also talk about sleep a lot. Because I say, you know, your biorhythms, your hormones, everything is dependent on it. And it's amazing how people are so sleep deprived. And I always say to people, you must get good nighttime habits.
Yeah.
I think you've got to create a bedtime that's good for you, and you've got to stick to it. And I know that for me, when I don't, the later I go to bed, the less well I sleep.
Yeah.
It's amazing, especially after midnight. But yes, stress really needs to be handled. So can you explain why stress has this effect? I mean, and not just for the heart. I mean, what does stress actually do to the body? Yeah. How does it work?
It's very interesting. It's not fully understood. There's lots of different mechanisms. From a heart disease perspective, the 2 drivers of heart disease are what we call chronic inflammation and insulin resistance. And stress seems to encourage more inflammatory markers to be released in the body, and that in excess over a period of time, because acutely it's fine, it can be actually very protective. From an evolutionary perspective, one of the reasons why inflammation and maybe clotting factors also increase with acute stress is because it was a fight or flight kind of response, right? So if we feel we're under threat from say a saber-toothed tiger that's going to maul us and we're going to bleed to death, the body reacts in a preventative way to increase clotting factors. But if you imagine that being there as a constant over many, many years, your blood's more sticky, you're more likely to have a heart attack.
Right.
So that's one of the mechanisms. Inflammation also probably is a reaction to deal with any cuts or whatever else that's going to happen. So that's probably one of the most important mechanisms. So in essence, in very simple terms, chronic stress makes your blood more sticky. And it basically increases it causes your immune system to also be slightly dysfunctional by excessively reacting.
So stress is bad. Stress is
There's
bad.
Lots of different mechanisms, but
So tell me, what would you say? What are your top 3 strategies for de-stressing?
Wow. Me personally.
Well, personally and medically, and you know, what do you think are the best things to do? Because I mean, stress is all around.
No, I know.
And it's really hard to contain.
So I think it will be naive not to try and at least identify a root trigger for it. Now I know this is harder to do, easier to say than to do, but we said earlier toxic, relationships and work stress. So is it
something you can change?
Is it something you can change?
Yeah.
You know?
So if you're in a job that you absolutely hate and you don't enjoy, that could be causing you huge stress.
Yeah. There's some great advice from Jay Shetty, who wrote this book called Think Like a Monk, and around a job. Very simple. Ideally, you want to be doing a job that you enjoy, you're good at, and then somehow gives back to the community. Because giving back actually is also a good way of reducing your stress, focusing on other people, right? Yes. So that may be one. In terms of on an individual level, we've talked about this as well, deep breathing. I use an app called Calm, but essentially just, for example, for the first 20 minutes of the day when I wake up, I meditate. And all it involves is...
I do try to, and I have an app called Headspace, and it just makes meditation so easy.
Just focus on the breathing, deep breathing, and do it for a long period of time, and you will notice yourself.
Breathing is incredible.
And physiologically, you can even check. Pulse rate goes down when you do deep breathing. It's amazing how quickly that can happen. So your mind can affect your physiology very quickly.
Yes.
Just looking at your heart
and
rate.
actually makes changes in your brain.
It does.
Which
it does.
shown.
And if you have a long period of time, absolutely.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
easy said than done, but that's something to think about. And then, actually to some degree, even just moderate exercise, going out for a walk, being out in nature.
Yes.
Get out,
Gosh, how many times have you all heard me say that? Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, well, exercise, releases endorphins, and as you say, but exercising outside and being in nature is incredible, and that's where having a dog is really useful. Yeah, absolutely. And so, if anybody is feeling stressed,
actually on that, get a pet.
Yes,
just having a pet, stroking a pet and all that.
Pets are very de-stressing. Yeah,
cortisol,
absolutely.
It reduces your stress hormone.
So identifying the trigger of your stress and seeing if you can do something about it, which I know is tricky sometimes, but sometimes it's right there in front of you and you can make a change.
And don't surround yourself with toxic people. So very simple rule of thumb: is the person I'm hanging out with, your friend, your partner, are they increasing your sense of well-being, emotional sense of well-being? And if they're not, don't hang out with them.
I know, and I think as we get older, and certainly for me, that is something I have begun to do. You just realise some people just don't make you feel good, and they're not good to be around. And if anybody is feeling stressed and wants to try some of these strategies, right here on the Ageless YouTube channel, I have a video on breathing that I have worked and is incredibly effective, especially for anxiety. So you can give that a go. Well, thank you so much. You've just confirmed everything I knew. Stress is the worst.